Holy fuck. What's the meaning of this shit?
Shalom ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I have once again returned to the realm of the living. Apologies for keeping you waiting. Now today's subject is going to be interesting, due to the fact that it's in relation to something I actually enjoy, and therefore we are taking a slightly more positive approach this time around. Now for those of you unaware, The Witcher is a franchise based on a series of fantasy novels written by I'm not even gonna try and pronounce that last name.
It's Sapkowski, you blithering retard.
Who originated from Poland, which is a country most people have never heard of, aside from some very obscure war caused by some dude whose name escapes me. And for those of you unaware, I actually like this franchise quite a bit, though this is mainly coming from the games and me reading the first book after I was done with them. There are a number of reasons as to why I think this series is worth checking out, which I will be going into as we discuss this franchise in what is most definitely going to be multiple videos.
Hey! No! Stop! Just calm down! Don't do it!
But to give you a brief idea, a lot of it stems from me liking some good old-fashioned fantasy. I feel Geralt is very likable and works incredibly well as a protagonist. I really like the universe and the world itself, which is populated by a good number of decent characters. It has an interesting exploration of certain themes, and I generally like how the games are structured and written. While I don't think it's perfect, far from it in fact, I believe a lot of elements in this series work very well. Now, it is no secret that I have been expecting this adaptation to be a complete misfire, partially due to the fact that the person in charge of this series is an inexperienced showrunner who I've never heard of. It's also due to the fact that this is being produced by the world's foremost child groomers, who haven't had a stellar track record in providing consistent quality content. Furthermore, the fact that I did not like any of the promotional material they had released for this show led me to believe we were in for something pretty bad. However, to my shock, it surprised me in the sense that it was less terrible than I was expecting. So congratulations, you mildly exceeded my incredibly low expectations.
Oh yes, well done!
Now, my issues with the show are not due to it being an adaptation, or rather due to it being an unfaithful one. I think, for the most part, they generally stick to the source material, though in a very bare bones and surface level way. Not great, not good even, but it's better than them going in drastic new directions that make it completely unrecognizable from the original work. Fidelity is something that should be actively strived for when it comes to adaptations, because while I understand changes will and need to be made, being as faithful as possible to the original is generally a wise idea, because you may or may not royally fuck up when you try to make substantially new changes. I mean, if you want to risk several dozen fans of the material you may end up butchering come down on your asshole, by all means suit yourself, but don't say you weren't warned. My actual issue with this series stems from the original material that they've created for it, as well as its overall structure, its pacing, its lack of clear direction, how the characters are written, and how each of them and their storylines relate to one another. On top of all that, the changes that are made for the series end up being for the worse, and elements that have been adapted from the books are not as well executed as they could have been. There are a number of problems here, and we're going to go through them in at least moderate detail. While I'm at it, I'll be making a few comparisons to both the books and the games, so apologies if this series seems structured a tad bit differently compared to my usual stuff. Now ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a lengthy process. I hope to get through this in a timely and efficient manner, but this is going to be a monster of a series. I'm going to be discussing this episode by episode, which is going to vary dependent on the episode, as there is more to discuss with some over others. Plus, the fundamental problems with the show can be explained relatively early on, but we'll get there when we get there. And, just going to make this clear now, this series of videos is only going to cover the first season of the show with some references to the second. The reason for this is that since I am, as the French say, completely retarded, and as the Australians say, a lazy cunt, I was not able to get this out in a timely manner, and my script for this video was written with only season 1 in mind. While I do believe a majority of the criticisms are mainly for the first season, some of them may be rectified later on. I would have done season 2 as well, but given the length of this script and these videos already, that is not something I am incredibly keen on doing at the moment. I will discuss the second season when appropriate, but for now the majority of the focus is going to be on the first season. Also, shouldn't have to be said, but there will be spoilers for the show, for the first 2 books and the games, but I will try to keep them minimal wherever possible. With that out of the way, let's get this started.
Let's rock.
So, while not immediately obvious, episode 1 gives off a horrible first impression for how you expect the rest of the show to turn out. Initially, the episode's opening is fine. It is serviceable. It starts off with a fight scene between an Australian spider and this white-haired gentleman, which results in the latter killing the former. And then we are fully introduced to our main protagonist, Geralt of Rivia.
Look, there he is!
So we might as well start talking about how Mr. Cavehill fares as Geralt. Now initially, I was indifferent to him being casted. I really don't give a shit about Superman, and I don't care if his portrayal as some overpowered homosexual was accurate or not, but I hadn't seen enough of his previous work to determine if he was a good fit. However, after watching a few interviews with him prior to watching the series, I warmed more and more up to the idea of him portraying Geralt as 1, he's actually read the books and played the games, and 2, he understands why people may be apprehensive about this series.
When it comes to fans, it is a fan's right to have whatever opinion they want to have. And people are going to be upset because, especially when you're talking about books or games, because you're never going to be the exact person who they had in their head or who they played on Witcher 3, for example. I don't necessarily consider that toxic, I just consider that passionate.
So /R Guy Cavill seemed like an actually decent choice, and I can say, as a whole, he is pretty good. One of the better parts of the show, in fact. He's not completely flawless, as there are times where his performance is a little weak, and granted, performing as a gravelly, emotionally stunted mutant isn't the most complex roles to play as, but he does a fine job nonetheless. I do prefer Doug Cockle's performance, however, as I felt his voice was more in line with Geralt's appearance and personality.
Plan's crazier than it is sane, but there's an irresistible charm to it. Offer me some pay and I'll help you out.
But while that is a comparison that will and should be made, I do think it's slightly unfair. Give a man 3 beefy RPGs, 2 expansion packs, and 1 subpar fighting game, and you're definitely going to become a lot more attached to his performance rather than the man who was only given 1 season of an exceedingly mediocre TV show, in which he only appears in less than half of the show's runtime. But as a whole, Mr. Cavill is fine, and me knowing full well that this man could likely cave in my head without too much of a struggle is in no way a factor in my judgment here. Anyway, back to where we left off. Now, for those of you unaware, this episode is primarily an adaptation of The Lesser Evil, a short story from the first book, and it's kind of both odd and interesting that they started off with this story as their opening episode. The reason why I think that is I would argue that it's the most important story of the book, as it is a clear-cut example of major themes that are used reoccurringly throughout the series. I figured that this episode would be towards the middle or the end of the series, but perhaps they thought that this was their best work and they wanted to start off the series with a strong opener. And I can tell you this now, it is absolutely not. Also, something to take note of, only half of the episode is focused on the short story. The other half focuses on something entirely different, and yes, this is a major problem that I will address shortly. Anyway, Geralt enters a town called Blaviken, which is a pretty important place when it comes to Geralt's history and his development as a character, and it is here where the series takes a turn for the worse. Like I said, the episode starts off alright, but I suspected something was already off when Geralt enters his tavern and is instantly despised by everyone the moment he steps inside. Now, this probably might just be me, but I find it a little silly that as soon as he puts 1 foot inside this place, everyone is instantly aware of his presence, and are immediately aware of what he is without even getting a proper glance at him. I feel like this is made even more of a problem by the fact that some of them are already more than willing to kill him with little to no build-up of tension.
We don't want your kind here, Witcher.
The Alderman. Tell me where he is, and I'll be on my way.
You don't give the orders around here. You mutant son of a bitch.
Hear that? Go. On your own, or at the end of a rope. Your choice.
Not a hard choice.
Yeah, fuck that. Kill him with your bare hands if you have to.
Now, before people jump down my throat, yes, I am aware that the first story within the novel starts off in a similar way, but my problem with this is not the fact that this scene exists, but mainly how it's set up and executed. Because I kind of have the same problem with the story that I do here, and that is that the build up to the confrontation, or rather potential confrontation, comes across as very rushed. I understand early on that they are trying to establish that witches aren't particularly well liked, since a vast majority of them are magically enhanced mutants, honest, most people are typically distrustful and wary of them because of that. That is perfectly fine that you want to set that up early, but by having these people on the verge of killing someone within the span of 30 seconds, their prejudices feel less authentic and more phony, and it kinda comes across as very rushed and clumsy. Unfortunately, that is going to become a reoccurring problem that we're going to delve into as we go along here, because the thing is, there are scenes like this that can actually work. The games have similar situations that Geralt is put in, which are handled a lot better. And while they aren't amazing, the reason that they work better than this is because there is an escalation of tension. There is an actual build-up to a confrontation which helps create a tense atmosphere, and puts into question whether a fight might actually occur. It's even more aggravating because the short story's beginning is perfectly fine, and I don't understand why they would change it if this is the end result. I know this seems like a nitpick, and yeah, it probably is, but I cannot at all take this scene seriously, because frankly, there are a lot better ways to communicate that witches aren't regarded as the most upstanding citizens. But funnily enough, I think the show itself provides a better example of how to present these prejudices later within the season. Again, this was a minor point, but it was something that I felt was worth making note of. Anyway, I'm going to quickly recap a lot of the information that is conveyed in this section of the episode, because while a lot of the dialogue here is okay, it's just not very interesting, and there's not really much of it that's worth really discussing or making note of. The real problems begin when we reach the end of the episode. So as Geralt is about to get lynched, this femoid, who is in charge of this gang of radical homosexuals, tells them to fuck off. She and Geralt have a minor conversation, which ends with the show winking at the audience and reminds them how humans are the real monsters.
More and more, I find monsters wherever I go.
And yes, shut up, I know it's a reoccurring theme throughout the series, it just doesn't need to be so blatant about it. Anyway, Geralt is looking to sell the corpse of the giant spider, which are incredibly rare purchases in Poland because they are unaware of what a spider actually is, and is led by a pygmy child to a sorcerer by the name of Stregobor, who lives in this tower that looks like it belongs on some suspicious looking island. Geralt immediately assumes that this dude wants something else from him, and he assumes correctly. He tells him that this girl, named Renfri, is actually cursed, because she was born during a Breath of the Wild blood moon and is inherently monstrous in nature. Also, given the fact that he tried to kill her because he believes she is Satan spawn, she is more than happy to return the favour. Stregobor then offers Geralt to deliver that good old thing known as capital punishment. Geralt is naturally skeptical of this claim that she is Satan spawn and refuses.
With the fate of the continent at stake, is that a charge you're willing to take? Killing Renfri is the lesser evil.
He's in, boys! He did it! He said it!
Geralt replies with the following.
Evil is evil, Stregobor. Lesser, greater, middling. It's all the same. I'm not judging you. I haven't only done good in my life either. But now, if I have to choose between one evil and another, then I prefer not to choose at all.
This is a good quote, if a little blatant, and the reason that I'm putting it here is because it provides good insight into Geralt as a character, and also as an example of a major theme throughout the series, that nothing is completely black and white within this universe. Anyway, Geralt decides to peace out and is later found by Renfri, who offers him to join her in killing Stregobor because he's a wee bit of a cunt.
An asshole!
She then tells him her sob story about how she was raped and lost everything because she got cursed.
Stregobor's man raped me, robbed me and let me go. No more, princess. I had to survive.
Which clearly makes her being a wanton murderer perfectly okay. Thing is, it's kind of hard to feel sympathetic to the person who is going to kill dozens of people with their Honda Civic if this wizard doesn't get out of his tower. Spoilers, by the way, that's her plan. Again, this is similar to the short story, especially this part. However, the difference is that there's more to this interaction rather than just a simple tragic backstory and her desire for revenge. There is an actual back and forth as they discuss their personal philosophies where they come across as fleshed out individuals. Here it's just a Cliff Notes version of one of their discussions and lacks any sort of personality that the short story had. Furthermore, Renfri's character felt more sympathetic in the story, as there were moments where she acted more human and appeared legitimately distressed by the prospect of her being some sort of monster, something that is lacking here. Geralt tells her to either fuck off and try to live a good life, or he's going to have to commit an act of misogyny. While she thinks the prospect of getting beaten is enticing, she decides to give up on that whole kill build the town thing, and she and Geralt have a long night of passionate bum tumbling. Geralt wakes up the next day and realizes her claims of giving up on that whole revenge thing were complete bullshit, and that she's still gonna commit several acts of murder in order to force the wizard out. Geralt rushes to stop her and encounters these upstanding gentlemen, and then we reach the final showdown.
I'll use this. A bread knife. A tool of justice. Well, that's a terrible name for a kitchen utensil.
The sequence of events I just described to you follow the short story for the most part, even though everything about it is way less interesting since all the interactions between the characters are kind of stale, but I'm at least glad that they were trying to keep in line with the story. The ending, however, they managed to fuck up completely. In the ending of the story, Geralt confronts this gang of merry men as they are on the verge of carving through a very crowded street. Geralt kills them all and then has a final fight with Renfri, killing her as well. Everyone, witnessing Geralt murdering around 8 or 9 people for seemingly no reason, are not too happy about this and effectively force Geralt out of the town with him never to return, and that is where the story ends. The ending in the show does have this sequence of events, but the differences in how they are presented and their overall impact are substantial. First immediate problem is that this clash between Geralt and this gang within the story happens slightly differently. The main difference is that this incident happened in a very crowded street, where there was a large number of people for them to turn into mincemeat, not in some almost empty alleyway where only a couple of people in the distance have a vague idea on what the hell is going on. The reason that this is a lot worse is because it makes the ending of this story way less interesting and impactful. In the short story, Geralt getting kicked out of the town because he openly murdered 8 people made sense because from the villagers' perspective, all they saw was this deranged mutant attack these people for seemingly no reason. They had no idea what was going on, and even if the situation was explained to them, it doesn't neglect the fact that a witcher took the law into his own hands by tearing these guys to shreds, shocking and terrifying the townspeople. The story has a lot more impact because despite Geralt having good intentions, he still came across as a feral and unhinged mutant in front of a crowd of people, thus in their minds proving whatever prejudices they may have had against him. The show lessens that said impact by having this confrontation in front of no one, because part of the reason that the townspeople were so shocked and terrified was that they had witnessed firsthand this witcher violently murder people.
Quick! Get out! Get out of here!
If you were to witness someone get eviscerated in a matter of seconds, that would clearly invoke a much stronger reaction, whether it either be disgust, shock, terror, etc., rather than if you only had heard about it later on, or had only just stumbled upon the aftermath. But because the show decided that no one is around to witness this carnage, the ending really doesn't have the same intended effect. This may come across as a minor thing, and feel free to disagree, but this seemingly minor difference actually changes a decent chunk of the context regarding this ending, but it only gets worse from here. So Geralt ends up fighting and killing these jolly lads in an okay fight scene, and then Renfri shows up with this pygmy girl threatening to kill her before she and Geralt engage in a fight. Geralt makes good on his word and commits misogyny. And ends the fight by stabbing her in the neck, and then leaves Geralt with some parting words, which I'll get to as it is more relevant to a point that I wish to make towards the end of the episode. Anyway, the female has been defeated. Stregobor then shows up and decides to take her body back to his tower for research purposes, and Geralt kindly tells him to fuck off. Not too impressed with this, he decides to turn the crowd against Geralt.
Witcher, you butchered bodies in the streets of Blaviken. You took the law into your own hands.
And then he says this.
You made a choice, and you'll never know if it was the right one.
This is exceptionally stupid for a number of reasons. The biggest of them all is that you have taken all sense of moral ambiguity away from this story by having him say this, thus completely destroying the point of the story itself. The reason that I think that this story is one of the most important within The Last Wish is because it provides a clear-cut example of one of the series' most reoccurring themes: consequence. Consequence is something that I consider an integral part of The Witcher. The choices Geralt makes are ones that will have both immediate and everlasting consequences. And this sense of consequence is something that I feel the games, especially the third one, were able to achieve incredibly well. Both the player and Geralt are presented with a series of choices throughout the games that have lasting impacts. choices that will determine the fates of certain characters, communities, and even nations, allowing both you and him to have an impact on how the world is shaped and changed. Furthermore, what makes these choices interesting is that a decent number of them do not give you a clear indication of what the best choice is. The choice you may think is the better option may end up resulting in consequences you didn't predict, and likewise the other choice you were given may hold different but equally as impactful consequences. The reason that this story is very important is because that Geralt will continue to feel the repercussions of the choices he's made here, choices he is constantly reminded of for the rest of his life.
The only way a humble merchant might hope to rub up against greatness, unless, that is, he's as lucky as I am.
And runs into a very patient witcher.
It's a Geralt of Rivia himself, the Butcher of Blaviken.
I'm Philip Strenger. Now the blobtits round here call me the Bloody Baron.
Geralt of Rivia. Blobtits call me the Butcher of Blaviken.
Not gonna lecture me? Make me promise to mend my ways?
They call me the Butcher of Blaviken for good reason. I know how it is. Sometimes heads just roll.
And the complex nature of these choices, within both the books and the games, is made evident by their inherent moral ambiguity. Within the Witcher universe, there are a number of morally grey choices that Geralt is faced with that do not lead to a simple black or white outcome. While that's not the case for everything, a major element of the series was the difficulty to determine the correct path with the options Geralt is given, and that was the point of the story, as you can tell by its title. What is the lesser evil? What is the best choice that can be made? This question makes the story more interesting because the story never gives a definitive answer, with characters having different opinions as to its inherent meaning. Because no matter what choice would have been made, blood was going to be spilt. Whether it be this wizard, this cursed girl and her band of merry men, or an entire town full of people, someone was going to die. And it is up to the reader to determine whether or not the choice that was made was the best path to take. While I will say that a fault with this story is that it handles this choice in a more clear-cut manner than I would prefer, and does slightly undercut the intended purpose behind the story, given that Renfri is more than happy to murder innocents, as well as associate herself with similar thinking individuals, there are 2 points that need to be made in relation to that. First of them being that despite the audience recognizing that he probably chose the lesser evil, Geralt himself is still unsure if he made the right choice. Geralt was forced to choose, and he chose, in the heat of the moment, what he thought would lead to the best outcome. But the point is, he doesn't know for sure if he had made the correct choice, which is made clearly evident by key lines throughout the story. He doesn't leave the town knowing that he made the right choice because it's doubtful if he ever knows if he made the right choice. Furthermore, another element that is missing here is that it is implied that Renfri might not have done anything, because in the end it would have been pointless. As Stregobor did not care about how many she killed, he wasn't going to give himself up. So if Geralt had stuck to his guns and done nothing, would that have resulted in a less bloody outcome? Again, given that she has already lied to him in the story, she could be lying again. But it is interpretive. There is no definitive answer for us or him, as he still questions Renfri's true nature well after these events have happened.
Was she truly monstrous?
She was cruel, that's certain. But what caused it? The curse or what she went through? Asking myself to this day.
Secondly, even if we acknowledge that the story itself says that he chose the lesser evil, it doesn't erase the story's discussion of the idea itself. Characters within the story still discuss and question the meaning of evil in all of its forms. This makes the story more interesting because it offers different viewpoints on the topic and raises a multitude of questions that the audience can figure out for themselves. This discussion of the meaning behind the lesser evil is nowhere near as prevalent in this series as it goes for a simple surface retelling of the story. A key example of this is that the following lines of dialogue are nowhere to be found within this episode. Now, I am not saying that they needed to verbatim copy the story word for word, but having some exploration of the story's main theme would make the events in this episode a lot more substantive, and would have definitely worked later on because this core theme is still extremely relevant to other stories within the series. The point that I'm trying to hammer home here is that this story is open for some interpretation, and does not make definitive statements about the events that occurred, because doing so lessens its overall overall impact. And that's exactly what the show does. In the story, Stregobor does try to take the body, and Geralt does tell him to fuck off. But what happens after is severely different. He then decides to back off and leave the town, and even offers Geralt to come with him as he knows full well that the townspeople might be a bit upset at the rampant murder that had just occurred. However, he leaves before the attempted lynching even starts. Much different to what we have here. Now, don't get me wrong, Stregobor in the novel is a cowardly asshole. Dude is more than willing to let dozens of people die so long as he's out of harm's way. But he doesn't turn the crowd against Geralt, and he doesn't go, "You stupid fucking idiot, you brain-deaded fool, you cretin, you fell for my master plan, you utter ignoramus, I tricked you this entire time, you absolute goobosaurus." Having this antagonistic character gloat to Geralt about whether he made the right choice is fucking stupid because it clearly indicates that he has made the wrong choice. This is made further evident later on as this dude is a reoccurring character throughout the series, and every time he is on screen, he's acting like a complete prick. So congratulations, you have managed to fuck up so much with simply one line of dialogue. The pygmy girl then also tells Geralt to leave, and this is another change that I feel is for the worse. In the story, the person who tells Geralt to leave Blaviken is the town's alderman. Fuck off! The reason why not having this character here is worse because it takes away from the tragedy of the story. The alderman was a friend of Geralt's. He willingly and happily let him sleep in his house and treated him with respect. He had asked Geralt to leave because while he was fully aware of the situation, he knew that the town wouldn't accept that answer, and partially due to him being upset with him as well as he had took actions into his own hands. I feel this had added to the tragedy of the story because Geralt ends up losing a place of comfort. There aren't a lot of places where he can go because, like I said, witches are pretty unwelcome in most communities. And losing a source of support and comfort that he could turn to further cemented this idea of consequence for Geralt's actions. Here, however, it's just a town full of assholes who treated him like an arsehole. And once he was done with his business here, he had no intention of ever coming back.
The alderman. Tell me where he is, and I'll be on my way.
It's dumb because this change doesn't add anything to that sense of loss, because neither Geralt nor us have any sort of attachment to this place. But whatever. So Geralt gets chased out of the town.
You're a beast!
You endanger the girl!
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye.
And that's where things end. Now, I would like to say that we are now done with episode 1, but unfortunately, the events that I just described to you is roughly half of the episode. Yes, throughout all of this, there is another intersecting plotline, and this leads to one of the biggest fundamental issues with the show. The other plotline for this episode revolves around Ciri, or Cirilla, who was Geralt's soon-to-be adopted daughter. Now, I can't really comment a whole lot on Ciri, at least in terms of the books, as I'm only really familiar with how her character is from the third game, in that she is a perfectly decent character, even though she is sorta, kinda, maybe a little bit of a Mary Sue. But in terms of her character in the show, holy hell is she fucking boring. I sort of understand what they were going for with her, in that she is somewhat of a vessel, in that she is used to explain things to the audience as this sheltered little white girl, who was violently uprooted from her typical environment and confronted with a reality that she was never really aware of. It's a perfectly fine way to start a character's story, and ultimately a good way for them to grow and develop as a character. But therein lies the problem, as it doesn't really feel like she grows as a character at all. Towards the end of the series, I will explain why her character is pretty terrible, but for now, I'll simply state that she ends up repeating the same mistakes over and over again, and is mostly pulled along her journey by other people. Furthermore, she just has a really dull personality. The most I gleaned from her character is that she acts like a tomboy whenever she wants to hang around the poor people, that she's kind of adult, and that she has the power of a white woman discussing political discourse in her car. Plus, half the time, I swear to God, she is making the same face, so she kind of feels like a blank slate, and unfortunately, that doesn't make for the most interesting character. Anyway, Ciri is the Princess of Cintra, which you wouldn't know unless you notice the 2 lines of dialogue where they actually say what this place is, who lives with her grandmother and step-grandfather, who are currently king and queen since her parents perished by a plague known as the Deadlol. They are standing in this knighting ceremony, and the show uses this as a way to establish these characters' dynamics. The king, or known as Iced, is a more laid-back jokester who can relate more with Ciri.
He's playing in the square.
Knucklebones. Did you win this time? I
The Queen, Calanthe, is a stern warmonger.
As members of the royal family, is it too much to ask that you exercise a modicum of respect?
And Ciri is just boring. The establishment of character here really doesn't mean that much, since these two will be dead within the next half an hour, or rather dead within the next half an hour of their plotline, as the episode bounces back and forth between these two segments. We then move on to this ballroom scene, which primarily focuses on a fairly important discussion that revolves around a nation within the Witcher universe known as Nilfgaard.
Saw the wraiths of Morhen over the channel this morning.
Yes, you mentioned, eh?
No good will come of it. They're an omen of war.
North has been at war since Nilfgaard took Ebbe. And legend is true. The Wild Hunt's years behind the curve.
The Nilfgaardian force crossed the Armor Pass.
Headed to Sodom if they're smart. And if not, 50 of your skeleton ships are on the way.
Now, if you are currently confused as to what the fuck they are talking about, that is completely understandable, because the show does an incredibly subpar job at initially explaining what any of this means. This is a very big problem, as throughout these episodes, they are talking about people, places, and events that may hold some significance to those familiar with the source material, but to anyone else they are going to have a little bit of trouble understanding what they are discussing. This is especially bad here because not only do you not understand what they are talking about, but you also lack understanding as to what are the stakes in regard to this conflict. So, to give a brief rundown here, Sintra is a kingdom located in the northern part of a landmass known as the continent, which serves as the main setting for the series. They are allegedly one of the strongest nations in the north, and serve as a buffer zone for potential invasions to other northern kingdoms. They also enjoy a good bit of elven genocide here and there, at least according to the show, because that is not the case in the books, and are fairly egalitarian in how they raise their children. Nilfgaard is more akin to a militaristic southern European empire, who were located south of the continent. Initially founded on a mixture of human and elves, Nilfgaard became a superpower after conquering and assimilating nearby kingdoms, thus making it one of the most powerful nations in the continent. They're a prevalent nation throughout the books, as well as the second and the third games. While there is a lot more to them, I am just giving a very brief rundown of what both these nations are about, more than the show initially does. Now, while they do a better job of giving us some insight into what Nilfgaard's deal is later on, this episode does a very bad job of doing it, especially when it's very important to do so, as this is the central conflict throughout the season, and currently we are lacking some of the context behind it. In order to set up a conflict like this, you need to have some insight into at least one of these nations for it to have any sort of weight, because at the moment the audience has little to no attachment to Sintra or the people within it. So when this scene ends with a sense of foreboding, oh shit, they're coming type of dread, it doesn't have the same impact as it should, because no one knows what Nilfgaard is, or what Sintra is for that matter. As far as the audience is concerned, Sintra could be a brutal monarchy that has been genociding people for years on end. The show ends up doing something along those lines anyway, because later Ciri is confronted with multiple people who have been negatively affected by the Queen's rule. And as far as we know, Nilfgaard could be liberators, hoping to stop this terrible kingdom by committing mass acts of misogyny. While that's somewhat of a hyperbolic example on my part, it still doesn't negate the fact that the show is not doing an adequate job of setting up the stakes for this conflict. This is going to sound incredibly condescending, but stakes help create tension, and tension helps keep the audience invested. So if your audience is not invested in what's going on here, when they see these characters get killed and see an entire kingdom fall, don't be surprised when they don't give a shit. Though this is in part due to the fact that all of this happens over the course of 30 minutes, so it's kinda hard to feel invested when all of this comes across as extremely rushed. And while yes, if you were vaguely familiar with the source material, you'd understand the wider implications of this invasion and this conflict. But that's the point. The show has failed as an adaptation because they failed to adequately inform the audience what exactly is going on. Given that I am familiar with the source material, I get the inherent meaning behind this invasion, but I really don't care that much. And that is because they've done a poor job of getting you invested in this world, this story, and these characters. The show also uses this scene to highlight that Ciri is sheltered when it comes to certain political matters, such as potential genocide.
We have more knights. We are prepared in case of...
Prepared for what?
We're talking of war, girl.
Nilfgaard. Why?
Should we fall to Nilfgaard, your granddaughter will rule. She needs to understand the way of things.
We will not fall because we are not under attack. She's a child.
And this sheltered lifestyle is set up for her character arc this season, which will lead to very little, but we'll get there when we get there. Anyway, the scene ends with Calanthe being dead wrong, and it looks like the Nilfgaards are already in their territory.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
What follows is a clash between Nilfgaard and Sintra in some unknown battlefield. While the battle itself is kind of okay, I am unsure of the strategic importance of this location, or where this battle is taking place, and it's kinda silly that there seems to be no strategy in this fight, but asking questions here is a somewhat redundant exercise, so it's whatever. Anyway, Sintra ends up getting demolished hardcore, and East ends up dying by taking an arrow to the face, and which results in a very dramatic death scene. Oh no, the character who has literally been on screen for 7 minutes and 33 seconds is now dead. I wonder how I will manage to cope. See, I wouldn't have minded about this scene so much if they didn't make such a fucking big deal about it. I'm sorry, but you seriously cannot expect me to be saddened by the overdramatic death of a character who has barely been explored, who we know very little about, and has been on screen for less than 10 minutes. A death scene like this only works when there is both narrative and emotional weight behind it. If you don't have that, you're really not going to leave much of an impact. And keep in mind, you need to be a fairly skilled writer if you're going to kill off a character who has been on screen for such a short amount of time and actually have it make an effect on me. So Sintra ends up losing as the Queen returns to the castle, now wounded and kingless, and apparently this battle will happen literally a few hours from their doorstep, because Nilfgaard is already at their gates. The royal advisor slash resident sorcerer known as Mousesack, who is a more important character later on, brings up a magic shield to buy them some time. Seeing as their kingdom is about to get totaled, and realizing that she's dying, Calanthe orders Ciri to escape and find Geralt.
I might do it fucking later.
And she and Ciri have a very emotional goodbye, and I just don't care. Because so far, there has been and will be very little interaction between these two that warrants this kind of emotional goodbye. They've shared roughly 4 scenes together, and while that's given us an idea of the type of relationship that they have, they've barely delved into it enough to have the audience care about this relationship or this goodbye. And the show tries to present these events, conflicts, and relationships as much more meaningful than they actually are. Perhaps, if more time was given to exploring these characters further, then what we were seeing would actually mean something substantial. But because a lot of this feels rushed, because we haven't seen these two interact much, or their characters truly been established, a lot of this comes across as shallow and phony. Not to mention manipulative in trying to make you feel something despite doing very little to deserve it. This is especially the case as after Calanthe tells Ciri to find Geralt, we get this dramatic scene where she throws herself off her tower, and where we watch this family of no-names kill themselves in order to prevent themselves from getting gutted by the funny German men. This comes across as a really bad attempt at trying to make me feel emotions you have not remotely earned show. Yes, I understand that the show thinks these deaths are important, and maybe they are, but they haven't earned this because again, why should I give a shit when you show characters dying who have only appeared for 2 scenes and said fuck all, and made no time delving into the significance of their deaths? I understand the inherent idea that they're trying to convey, a general sense of loss for these people and this kingdom, but again, you haven't earned that because the audience has no real attachment to this place. We've been given a brief look at how it operates, yes, but since the show has not established a sense of connection between the characters, this kingdom, or the audience, the mood that they are trying to convey is not as emotionally resonant as it could be. Having these events happen so early in the series is kind of odd to me because you haven't adequately established why we should care about these characters and this kingdom, and what is the impact that losing both of these will have. I don't care about these characters dying, or this kingdom falling to a foreign power, power because not enough time or dedication has been put into these events. Again, if one were more familiar with the source material, perhaps this would have more of an impact, but as we've already discussed, that in itself is another problem. Also, really love the quality CGI blood that they edited in here, and yes, I'm being nitpicky. And my response to that is shut up. I don't care, no one asked, plus you're British. I will say that I wouldn't really be commenting on this as much if I was remotely invested in what was going on, but I'm not. That in part is due to the events within this episode and within both stories being presented in a way that does not make them compelling or intriguing. Moving on, Clanfe kills herself after being called cringe.
Your life is nothing. You serve zero purpose. Kill yourself and give somebody else a piece of that oxygen and ozone layer that's covered up so that we can breathe inside this blue trap bubble. Because what are you here for? You should kill yourself.
Anywho, Ciri escapes but is almost instantly captured by Kaer, who was our main reoccurring villain for this series, at least for Ciri's storyline, and to be extremely blunt, he is kind of uninteresting. His main thing is that he wishes to help Ciri fulfill her destiny, whatever that is, and for reasons that are not yet explained, as well as be destined to be a part of this great empire. And that's all he really has going for him. In fairness, I don't think many of the major villains throughout the franchise are typically complex or interesting, with rare exceptions, so I'm not going to fault the show too much in terms of this character. Regardless, seeing her home burnt to the ground, Ciri activates her white woman power and escapes once more. And that concludes the first episode. So, my beloved audience, who all have extremely large penises, you may be wondering what the events of Part A with Geralt and what the events of Part B with Ciri have to do with each other. If your guess was very little, you would be absolutely right. Because something that is very crucial to take note of here, and something that the show does an absolute terrible job of communicating, is that most of the episodes are presented in a non-linear way. So, genuine question everyone, what do you think is the current difference in time between Part A and Part B? This will be on the test, so be sure to write it down. Now, if your answer was over 30 years, congratulations, you are right on the money. Yes, that's right, the events of Part A happened 32 years before the events of Part B, and the main thing that connects them is literally one line of dialogue.
The girl in the woods will be with you always. She's your destiny.
This is dumb because 1, this was not in the book, which changes her death that had way more impact, and 2, it's quite honestly the shittiest way of trying to link your stories to one another. Oh, instead of these storylines linking up and connecting them in a meaningful and interesting way, let's just have this character say this incredibly vague prophecy.
Yo, listen up, Nick. In about 30 years, you're gonna find some girl in the woods or some shit. I don't know. I'm dying now. So peace out, white boy.
The reason that this non-linear storytelling is an issue here is because not only is it confusing, but it causes issues in terms of both pacing and relevancy. And this is going to be made even worse in the next episode, as we are introduced to another intersecting plotline, which is set even earlier than these ones. Now, I understand the intention was to focus on each of these characters separately, as they grow and develop, and then slowly take these branching storylines and mesh them into one main storyline, but how this is carried out does not work in the slightest. Now, something that I want to make clear is that this is probably the most common criticism that the creators of the show got during this season. However, to their credit, they actually decided to do away with this idea in the second season and focus the storytelling in a more streamlined way. So good on them for actually listening to criticism, though whether it's much of an improvement in terms of pacing and storytelling is another question, but it's good at least some improvement is being made. However, I'm still going to comment on and criticize it because there is a larger issue outside of it simply being jarring and confusing. Now, 2 things, I'm perfectly happy with stories that show varying perspectives or plot lines that may initially seem unrelated to one another, but later on converge in some shape or form. In fact, I think it's especially useful for fantasy and sci-fi stories, because it allows you to get a stronger grasp on how the story's universe functions, and fleshes out its world, which makes it seem that much more authentic. Secondly, I am not saying that stories with a non-linear narrative are bad. In fact, that is how the first book is structured. Each story is set in a different time and place, with only a very light overarching narrative spliced in between. But the thing is, that worked because each story was standalone. They did not try to make some larger narrative in between, because the book was solely focused on Geralt's stories, while also setting up the world and the universe within the background. The reason why it's a bad idea to do it here is because of its execution. While there is some indication that these are separate timelines, it's very easy to miss, and comes off as confusing and jarring when you keep switching back and forth, especially when neither of them are relevant to one another, aside from one vague sentence from some cursed murderer. Now, I wouldn't have had a problem here if there was more cohesion between these two stories, either narratively or thematically, but there isn't, because while Geralt's section of the episode is called back to throughout the season, it is never ever relevant to the events and series section. Aside from there being no cohesion between these storylines early on, the time spent on them fluctuates depending on the episode. This results in the biggest issue for this season. Because of it constantly switching back and forth, the pacing of each episode suffers substantially, and instead of focusing on one really good story, you've got two half-baked ones that struggle to either be faithful to their original counterpart or aren't creating an emotionally compelling narrative. Both of them feel rushed, and both of them become worse because of it. In my personal opinion, even though no one gives a shit, I would have preferred if they had either saved Part B for a later season and expanded upon it, or removed it entirely. Focusing solely on Part A would have been a lot better, because you could put way more time and effort into making the story a lot more impactful and fulfilling. And yes, while the story is short, around 30 pages on a PDF, you could not only adapt everything in it, but add more to the story that could make it better. You could make Stregobor and Renfri more sympathetic, for example, so the choice that Geralt must make is that much harder. You could make the town more friendly, so you could further understand Geralt's willingness to defend it. You could do a lot of things that would expand on the story rather than detract from it. I feel having each episode focus on one story from the first book would be a lot better, because each episode could be standalone, and you have enough time, money, and material to make sure that each story is not only adapted faithfully, but also expanded upon and perhaps even improved upon its source material. But seeing how now the show has panned out, it's just wishful thinking on my part, if it wasn't already. By focusing on separate storylines for the first half of the season, with only minimal reference to one another, you've created not only a weaker storyline, but a weaker way to introduce these characters and give them the justice that fans of the franchise would much rather prefer. Anyway, I think we should move on, because I've spent more than enough time on episode 1. So, before I begin tearing into the show once again, I'll provide some mildly positive feedback and say at times the show can actually look fairly impressive. While I'm not a huge fan of how desaturated the show can look at times, and I do think a good chunk of the sets and locations look a little cheap and artificial, I think there are several points where they at least look decent visually, or are appropriately grim and gritty, fitting in well with the franchise. This refugee camp serves as a decent example of that. And hell, I actually think Blaviken, as this dank, often ignored shithole, looks close to how I imagined it in the books. The series in general has an underlying grittiness to it, which I think adds to the morally ambiguous nature of the series. The games were able to pull this off pretty well, by maintaining a good balance between gritty and unkempt environments with more fantastical, lush environments. It felt like a lot of effort went into making the world not realistic, but grounded to a degree. Well, as grounded as you can be, given that this universe involves things such as overpowered monsters, an army of ghost riders, and women, but I think you get what I mean. That's not to say that the show isn't trying, because unlike a lot of things, I feel they are at least trying with certain aspects of the show, because while there is a decent chunk of them that are hit or miss, I feel typically the show is able to make these locations appear more authentic and believable when they are on a smaller scale, because I feel like they're usually able to get more out of their environments that way. But when they try and make these locations on a grander scale, they don't really achieve it that well, at least for me personally, because in shots like these, they both look and feel inorganic, and there's just something about them that instantly takes me out of what I'm watching. Just in case that the stellar storytelling storytelling so far hasn't done that already. But regardless, I think we should move on. Now, unfortunately, I have to say that episode 2 is even worse in terms of pacing than episode 1, because, as I've mentioned, this episode introduces yet another character storyline, which revolves around Yennefer. Again, for those of you unaware, Yennefer is a sorceress, a former bell ringer, and is Geralt's resident on and off goo depository. Now, this is probably a shit take, but I'm really not a fan of this character. I may be alone on this, because I really don't know what the general consensus on her character is, but my key issues with her stem mainly from her overall demeanor and attitude, as well as how she treats Geralt like absolute shit at times and feels little to no guilt about it. I know her acting like a condescending bitch 50% of the time is somewhat of a, well, act, but I'm just not that much of a fan of it. While I might be being a tad bit reductive, I just really don't like her, and at best I feel indifferent about her. But, being that as it may, I would much rather prefer her book or video game version than the show's interpretation of her. Cause a key thing to take note of here is that her plotline in the show is completely new and original, and oh boy does it show. While I wouldn't say this is the worst part of the season, it's definitely a close second. The one quality thing I will say about her storyline is that unlike others, Yennefer actually has character progression, as she fundamentally changes as a character over the course of the season in more ways than one. But compliments like that for both her and her storyline are few and far between, unfortunately. Ignoring her character, Yennefer's storyline is just kind of dull as a whole. The start of this episode details her origins, where she is just this crippled hunchback girl who almost gets raped for being a peeping Tom, and she activates her magic powers. She then meets this delightful fellow who she is going to be wiener slapping for the next 2 episodes. We then get a glimpse into her home life, and soon learn that while her relationship with her mother seems at least fine, the opposite can be said with her father, who was more than happy to sell her off to this mage woman for minimal price.
How much for this beast?
6.
4.
What are you doing?
So,
Are you fucking kidding me?
And believe me, this is going to explain a lot about her character's actions as we continue to cover these episodes. So Yen is bought by this mage woman named Tensei, who seeks to train her and other students into becoming sorceresses, and also uses this as a perfect opportunity to start spouting Warhammer 40k lore.
Chaos is the most dangerous thing in this world. It is all around us, all the time, volatile and powerful. Each one of you showed an aptitude for channeling it.
The thought of kowtowing to these creatures disgusts me.
And this is the main focus for Yennefer during this episode, her trying to adapt and learn her magical powers, which are a part of her arc for this season. And fundamentally, it's okay. It's perfectly serviceable in establishing not only character, but also how magic is used within this universe. Don't ask me to explain it though, because I've played all 3 games, and even I'm still kind of unsure on how the hell certain magic functions within this universe. The issue is that I'm not invested in anything that goes on here. I'm not interested in whatever happens to Yennefer, I'm not interested in her training, I'm not interested in whatever happens to her and this delightful fellow's relationship, and I'm not interested in the relationship between her and her teacher. Part of it is due to not being a great fan of her character, but it's also due to A, her storyline is irrelevant to what is happening in the other storylines, and B, is that I am already aware of how things are going to end up. Now, to someone who is less familiar with the source material, this plotline wouldn't feel as redundant, so at least those not in the loop may have a better understanding of how magic functions, and a better understanding as to who Yennefer is. But to me, I feel no interest or tension in what's currently happening. Throughout this episode, Yennefer struggles trying to learn magic, but I don't feel any tension or interest in knowing if she does get better at it, because I know full well she does end up mastering it. I know full well she's going to be teleporting in an episode or 2. I know full well that she's going to lose her hunchback at some point in the show, and I know full well that this relationship with this delightful gentleman isn't going to last, because in 50 years, Geralt is going to be diving pelvis first into her meat folds. Now, one may argue that despite me knowing this information, this plotline itself could still be done well enough to have me invested or interested in what is going on, and you would be right. A film or show that is written, edited, and filmed with both skill and talent can still grip you immensely, even if you know full well what is going to happen. But again, that's the problem. I don't think the way her storyline is written is intriguing, engaging, or something that I haven't seen done better up previously. In fact, I find a lot of this just unnecessary to begin with because I don't think we need this detailed backstory. Now, while more detailed character backstories are necessary in many cases, as they're extremely important, I believe characters such as this work a lot better when their backstory is a lot more compact and minimal, because a decent amount of the characters early on are first introduced through Geralt's perspective, so both him and the reader are trying to get a grasp on what kind of person they are. This results in a decent amount of intrigue into who these characters are and how they came to be, and to me works a lot better in establishing them into the story. Here, it just feels needlessly long and kinda dull, and provides less mystique when it comes to these characters. This is more so a problem that occurs with Geralt later within the series, which I'll get to when we get there, but I feel it's also prevalent here. If her story was more engaging, I wouldn't be making this complaint, or it wouldn't hold as much weight, but given how it's handled, I just don't find this that compelling. Again, maybe I would be more interested in what was going on if I was less aware of where things ended up, but given that isn't the case, I just feel all of this is redundant. And when we get to these scenes, I'm also just waiting for them to move along so we can get to something more interesting. Which leads to another problem. Both Yen's and Ciri's storylines in this show are reoccurring throughout the season, whereas Geralt's sections are based on the stories within the first two books, which are all standalone, meaning that both the stories and the majority of the segments they are based on typically have an ending, with most of the events that occur within them being resolved. However, because the show needs to accommodate for the other two sections, about half of Geralt's stories, if not more, end up being rushed the majority of the time, because they need to quickly wrap up his story for that episode. I fundamentally do not understand why they did this, because ultimately it feels like Geralt is being shortchanged by putting more focus into these other stories that are far less interesting. And like I mentioned with the first episode, due to the lack of time spent on them, they're not as impactful as they could or should have been. This leads us into Geralt's storyline for this episode, which introduces Jaskier, otherwise known as Dandelion, who was Geralt's best friend. His character in the show is kind of lame. Throughout the season, he's mostly used as comedic relief, while also being a connoisseur of brown women and playing a mean lute. Aside from that, there is very little to his role within the series. As a whole though, he's whatever. He's fairly annoying most of the time, nor is he very funny.
You don't want to keep a man with bread in his pants waiting.
But he could have been a lot worse. What I will say is I really do like his and Geralt's relationship. In the games and the books, that is. Their dynamic, with Geralt akin to a disgruntled dad, and Dandelion as his slightly retarded goofball of a son, who is much smarter than many suspect, generally involved a decent chunk of needed brevity and lightheartedness to the stories, which was fairly entertaining to watch and read, and worked because of the obvious differences in their personalities. However, beyond that, it always felt like they were actually good friends who cared for and supported one another despite the obvious differences in their personalities. I feel the show kinda attempts to do something similar, but I don't think they managed to pull it off very well, and I don't think their relationship is as strong as it should have been, mainly because Geralt keeps telling him to fuck off almost every time they are on screen.
Come here.
Yeah.
All in all, this is just a somewhat irritating, if generally harmless dynamic, but it really could have been something a lot better. A lot of this plotline consists of Jaskier following Geralt around as he goes to fight a monster, which turns out to be a Sylvan, and they both get captured by a bunch of elves. This is to establish that elves have been kind of fucked over consistently by humans within the Witcher universe.
Does it live up to the tales you humans tell?
And when their leader plans to kill them before they can tell anyone about their shitty cave hideout, Geralt tells him that's fucking stupid and he should find a new place to live.
Then go somewhere else.
Moved by these powerful words of wisdom, the elf leader sets Geralt and Jaskier free, and that concludes their section of the episode. If it seems like I got through that very quickly, that is because this entire section's total runtime is 15 minutes.
Okay, that's all the time I've got.
And with that, I hope you can now understand why I think Geralt has been kind of shortchanged when it comes to this show. So let's get the first and clearly most prevalent issue here out of the way. They have completely gutted a vast majority of the story by doing this, effectively only adapting a bit of the beginning, a tiny bit of the middle, and a decent chunk of the end. Stellar, that is. And before you ask, no, they do not use the 15 minutes that they have effectively. There is barely a plot here. Geralt gets gets a job, they leave, they arrive somewhere, they get captured, Geralt calls an elf gay, and they get released. There is next to nothing in terms of well-structured and intriguing storytelling here. There are shows that have episodes with shorter runtimes that are more complex than this. Then we have how they've used this short amount of time as a means to establish elves not only as a race, but also establish their intensive and extensive history with humans. They explore this in the scene where they are captured by having Geralt and the elf leader in this intense back and forth argument, with Geralt delivering this important speech.
Show the humans that you are more than what they fear you to be.
Surprisingly, this does not come across as impactful as you think it is when there is virtually zero build-up and time given to them and this conflict. In fairness, they also do briefly discuss them in Yennefer's section, as we learn she's part elf, as well as Ciri's where she is assisted by an elf and they also are briefly mentioned. So at least compared to the first episode, there is some mild thematic relevance to each of these sections. However, despite that, it is only a very loose connection between these three storylines. Now, a counterpoint to this is that in The Edge of the World, they only really delve into the plight of the elves in one chapter towards the end, which would be around a similar length of time in comparison to the episode. And yeah, I wouldn't disagree. A handful of things to take note of though is, one, despite the conversation being generally similar, the story's discussion flows a bit better and does not seem as rushed, as well as the back and forth itself being more interesting. Furthermore, in the story, there is an actual conclusion to the events that are shown, and there is a decent chunk of subtext you can infer from the ending. The show does not achieve this, however, because, surprise surprise, they changed the ending. In fact, they barely give it an ending at all. The scene in which they are released ends with some suspense, where they try to imply that the elf leader
Philovandrel
is about to kill them, which I don't buy for a second, but next time we see them, they are walking away no problem. Pretty anticlimactic to say the least. So there was nothing else important to say, no interesting idea they could have explored even just very briefly? Just cut their binds, slap them on the bum and send them on their way? Okay. And they just kind of resolved this by saying what happened rather than showing it.
Haha, it is very cool that they let us go after I told them that they are losers and that I'm very cool and epic. Haha, very true my friend. It is also very cool that they gave me this sick loot. I shall now write a power ballad talking about how cool and epic you are. I'm going to stab you to death in your
So yeah, I really would not call these two parts of the story all that comparable. The sequence of events that happen in the Edge of the World feel like they're a part of the story, whereas the events in this episode more so come across as quickly establishing Jaskier as a character and providing a necessary lore dump, because this primarily reads as setup for later seasons, as this conflict with elves is mostly irrelevant for the rest of the season. The show will only refer to the elves a few more times with one character, and a somewhat important scene with Yen, but other than that, there really isn't much focus on this conflict between these two species. So quite frankly, I'm really not invested in what goes on here right now, despite even being aware of the wider context to it based on prior knowledge. Because I do know a decent chunk of the context behind the elven stuff from the games and the books, but that is because they spent several hours developing them. They allowed for several opportunities to learn about their history and establish a number of details about them. Furthermore, the conflict itself is more interesting because there is more nuance to it, as let's just say that elven hands aren't entirely clean when it comes to associating with other races either, so obviously the conflict between races seemed a lot more meaningful because of it. However, none of this is at all explored this season. You may consider that an unfair example, and yes, an 8-hour series is not going to convey as much history as the books or the games, but there's still plenty of time and opportunity for you to get invested in this conflict so long as they dedicate at least some time into it. But all we have at the moment is this fairly overdramatic scene that provides very little tension or interest. So yeah, not on the edge of my seat in regards to this conflict at the moment, and I doubt that's subject to change. Furthermore, fuck knife ears, they had it coming, maybe don't be such fucking losers next time. Dwarf pride worldwide.
No, not enough. Try again. Harder.
The only real thing that this section succeeds in doing is barely establishing a friendship between these two, but even then, it's kind of underwhelming, again due to their relationship not being as strong as it could have been. Anyway, that wraps up Geralt's section for this episode, which now then leads us into Ciri's, which is meh. It essentially follows up from last episode, with her running away in a forest where she eventually stumbles upon this scavenger, spouts off about how someone is after her, she eats some rats or something, and then she finds a refugee camp after her new BFF disappears. Here she learns that her grandmother wasn't the greatest ruler in the world, according to some refugees, including this family that takes her in.
This food was provided by the Queen.
May she rot in hell. Our father just died.
fighting to defend that wretched bitch. One conflict after another, robbing us of our homes, our men, and our lives.
Now stuff like this I think actually works because given Ciri's background as a sheltered white girl in a castle, having her face different opinions and beliefs from outside perspectives allows for great opportunities for character development. Having her receive information such as this would allow Ciri to question how the world really is, recognise herself that she has very little understanding of it, and put into question her place within it. The show kind of explores this by Ciri experiencing situations where she has to be a lot more on guard and less trusting of the people around her, and they kind of go in that direction for like a handful of scenes before they completely throw it out the window. And this is super frustrating because this type of material and these types of interactions with people who are getting the full brunt of an ongoing war would offer plenty of opportunities for meaningful character progression that the show neglects to capitalize on. After this, we also get this scene where Ciri struggles to sleep, and it's one that I think is alright and actually shows some potential for Ciri as a character.
What about your mother? Or your father?
My parents died when I was a baby. My grandmother took care of me.
Where is she?
She died in the Nilfgaard attack.
I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry too.
I think this scene works because it gives the impression that Ciri is not only trying to process the death of those closest to her, but also deal with the guilt she might be feeling towards those who have been affected by this war, after seeing it and hearing it directly. The people her grandmother, and by extension her, were supposed to protect. Now this might be me reading too much into it, but given what they've shown us this episode, I have a strong indication that was their intention. And if it was, props to them because I think they were able to pull it off decently. Unfortunately, this is one of the few instances where something interesting like that occurs, and Ciri, for the most part, remains just extremely bland. But no, please tell me how she's such a great character. I patiently await the lengthy essays detailing her defining characteristics, and I am just someone who is too unintelligent to see the deep complexities of this pasty white girl. I look forward to all of them being wrong. Aside from what I just commented on, there isn't too much to pick apart here. The rest of this isn't too enthralling, and not a lot happens plot-wise until the camp gets raided by Nilfgaard a day after Ciri arrives. The family she interacted with gets murdered, with the mother getting stabbed to death by the dwarf servant for saying one too many comments about how if you're below 5'10 you should kill yourself, and her son trips and falls on a suspicious looking arrow. Then the scavenger from earlier rescues Ciri, and is revealed to be an elf officially named Dara. And that's about it really. While I'd argue that the first episode irritated me more, this episode is worse because one of the three plotlines is nothing really substantive, another has a few interesting ideas that ultimately lead nowhere, and the third has no real tension or intrigue in terms of the plot that is going on. We are currently 25% through this series, and at this point I wasn't holding out much hope for the rest of the season to be stellar. But hey, let's see how things turn out.